Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We're going to give people just a couple minutes to get in and then we will get started. And our Q&A will be open the whole talk. So if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in there and we will either see them as we go along or get to them at the end. We're so excited that so many of you could be here today. I'm going to get our slides up so we can get that part started. Jennifer, can you see these okay? You're going to be my thumbs up for the moment. Slides are coming through. Okay, great. Awesome. Well, again, welcome everybody. We're so happy that you're here. We're just going to give it 2 more minutes to let some people coming in out of the waiting room, and we will get started. Okay, ready? Sarah, Jennifer, we're ready. We'll get the party
Yes,
started. Okay,
that sounds great.
awesome. Well, hi, everybody. We're so excited that you're here. This is Nourishing Body and Soul. We're going to be talking about embracing postpartum life. Such a thing is possible. We'll start with some introductions about ourselves and the brands that we represent. The 3 of us are really excited to be here together to talk about this topic from, I think, 3 different angles, and the more support, the better. This is a comprehensive, holistic approach to postpartum recovery, which we know involves so many factors for all of us. And the 3 of us have been there personally and professionally. So we bring that experience to bear. So I'm Marielle Benjamin. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm the mom of 2 wonderful and challenging children, Lucas, who is 9, and Madeline, who is 12. And I'm here today representing Cooper, our virtual parenting home base. At Cooper, we lead psychoeducational groups to talk about child's development, to understand the why between some of the behavior that we're seeing and experiencing, and give the practical tips on how to manage the day to day highs and lows, joys and challenges. We have lots of different features beyond our monthly groups, including a 24-hour virtual chat and incredible assemblies like this one today, and lots of PDF resources and handouts and one-on-one sessions as well. So if you're interested in Cooper, we'll have some codes at the end, but we would love to see you there. And I'm going to turn it over to, I think it's Jennifer nope, it's Sarah who's next, to
Hi.
introduce herself and Mavida.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sarah Orrick. I'm a reproductive psychiatrist by training, and a lot of people don't know what that is, but it's really specialized in how female reproductive hormones impact mental health, and particularly through this journey to motherhood, and how many bumps there can be along the way. So I actually got into this field before I was a mother, but I'm now a mother to 3, 2 toddlers and a month old. So I'm in the thick of it right now. And I really created Mavida Health out of a need to, I think, get more specialized care, both therapy and medication prescribing to these people that need it during this journey to parenthood, all the way from trying to conceive through the postpartum. And so we offer individual, group, and couples therapy, as well as that really highly specialized medication prescribing, in addition to some content that's all created by our in-house staff, all evidence-based, as well as community offerings to support those that are having a bit more struggles and maybe having symptoms of depression and anxiety during this journey. So check out Mavida Health.
Awesome. And Jennifer, you're up.
Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here. I am the co-founder of Chiyo. I'm also a clinical nutritionist. And so if you haven't heard of Chiyo, we are a personalized and integrative food as medicine platform. Our MVP product has been our postpartum meal programs and our newly launched nutrition hub. And so similar to Sarah, we really care about the latest research in nutrition. How does that support through these stages of fertility, pregnancy, and postpartum? And we're extremely excited today to teach you a little bit more about how nutrition really helps you prepare for your postpartum.
Awesome. So again, we're all three of us excited to be here and talk about all angles. We all love questions and interruptions. So throw anything in the Q&A and we'll do our best to keep an eye on it. And I think, Sarah, you're going to kick
Yes.
us off.
Yeah, so I just want to get started with when things aren't going totally the way that we wish they would, to just sort of introduce it. So perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, or PMADs, are what we really think about as, I think right now we talk about it as the postpartum. It's so interesting that postpartum has become synonymous sometimes with postpartum depression, when the postpartum is actually a slew of other things. But really, it's important to note that a lot of these issues can start during pregnancy, and that they actually last up to 5 years after birth. And I'll tell you, I'll talk a little bit about the brain changes that we experience, which is a little bit of kind of line into why we have some of these changes kind of occur. What we used to think was the postpartum would last a couple weeks or only a year, but we now know that it really lasts much longer. And so approximately 1 in 3 women will meet the criteria for what we call is a perinatal mood and anxiety disorder. And what I want to say with that is that, some level of sadness, some level of worry is totally normal during pregnancy and the postpartum. Well, I don't have a slide on it in particular, but I'm sure you all have talked about at Cooper, that matrescence. So this was a similar term, a similar pronunciation to adolescence, and in some ways, a very similar concept that as we transform into mothers, or you have this experience of matrescence, you have psychological changes, hormonal changes, your whole family dynamic really shifts. And so I want to just be clear that when we experience those, there's a lot of normal ups and downs and bumps along the way. But when they start to really impair functioning, when you're not deriving much joy from the experience, and again, there can be highs and lows, and that's important to kind of start to normalize. But when they start to go beyond that, where you're really, really struggling, is when we kind of think about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And again, what I'd like to say is that there's a lot of risk factors for perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, but some of the best ways to kind of combat them and to prevent them from happening are things like support, like a Cooper, right? Things like great nutrition, family support systems, all of those sort of coping skills that we think are important. If you have any kind of, movement practice, I absolutely love that. Breath, all of those things can be really foundational pieces to help you. And we don't talk enough about preventative care, unfortunately, but I think those are really fantastic ways to intervene. But if you're already in the postpartum, I think it's important to kind of think about whether you are struggling. There are resources like Mavida now. But again, there's a big assembly of things that we can do to kind of prevent these things from happening. What we can't prevent from happening are these very real brain changes that happen for everyone, that is, biologically pregnant, but actually we see some of these changes also in primary caregivers that aren't, so that they've maybe adopted a baby or have had a surrogate carry their baby. We still see some of these brain changes, which is so fascinating. So we see that gray matter shrinks, and so at first that sounds like, oh God, that's really scary, but it actually is really interesting, because what happens is that some areas shrink to sort of become and for some areas to develop a little bit more. And some of the areas that develop in this gray matter shrinking or pruning is actually more empathy, nonverbal communication skills, which is exactly what you need to communicate with this infant who is not yet verbal. The hippocampus seems to have some areas of decrease, which is interesting because that's associated with memory. And a lot of pregnant and postpartum patients will say, I have mom brain. I can't remember that place I ate at 2 days ago, or like, what is going on? And what's really interesting, it's actually the superpower. Your brain is changing. So yeah, maybe you don't remember the name of that actor in that movie, but like you are able to communicate and kind of understand your baby a little bit more. This is why it's so miraculous when I see mothers be able to say, oh, she's hungry right now. And you're like, but like, it's just a cry. And they're like, no, that cry is different, right? There's something that really just kind of blossoms and shifts in this really exciting way. The amygdala also increases, which is what we call the alarm system of the brain. And that can actually have what people think is pretty scary outcomes, but I think it is biologically driven. So this is what we often see as like the warning signs. It actually, I think, is associated with intrusive thoughts, which happen a lot to people in the postpartum, where, for example, one that recurs for me is I'm walking down the stairs holding my baby and I imagine them falling out of my arms. But what it in fact is doing biologically when we step back is it's sort of making me aware of a danger that's ahead of me. And I can sort of hold my baby a little bit tighter, watch my footing so I don't slip and fall. But what we sometimes see is that can, for people who have a history, for example, of anxiety or panic disorder, it can really sort of increase or heighten some of these sensations. So again, we think it's biologically driven, but if it's something that is disturbing to you, that's constantly happening, that's not allowing you, for example, to like give your baby a bath because you're afraid of something happening or that you may drown the baby or something like that, this is something where it's really important to start to kind of think about talking to a professional about these issues. And these changes last for over 2 years. And this is very early data. As you may all know, women's health generally is under-researched. Hopefully that's going to change. But what we see is that some of these changes continue and sometimes last even more than 2 years. And so that's why we're thinking of that postpartum is lasting even 5 years. So it's not just a year after childbirth. And again, it's so important to note, though gray matter shrinking may sound scary at first, a lot of these are really advantageous and kind of exciting.
I'm going to say that mom brain where you have to forget some things in order to remember others lasts way beyond 5 years.
Yes, 100%.
I still feel good about blaming that mom brain 12 years out of postpartum.
Like word finding is difficult, but that emotional
right.
connection that you have with your children is really exciting. And so, I think yeah. And on that note, if you're finding that there's impairment in the way that you're bonding with your infant, or it just doesn't feel right, I think, again, these are some of the warning signs that I like to talk about, especially in the postpartum, when there's a lot of preoccupation with infant health and safety, and, not being able to fall asleep when the baby's asleep, or even overnight when the baby starts sleeping long stretches of time, because you're so afraid of like, are they still breathing? Are they going to have sudden infant death syndrome? Like those are ways that those are some reasons we get a little bit concerned, as well as not allowing other caregivers to kind of share, because I think one of the overarching issues here, or something that is a takeaway, is that really it does take a village. We were not meant to parent. That's not an individual sport. It really is a group sport. And so if you're finding that you're doing the bulk of everything, unable to ask for help or support, that's an area where we really think, there could be more, and certainly professional help is important. And then reporting high stress, infant sleep issues. These are all things that we want to sort of think about as you're thinking, is this kind of within the normal range, or am I kind of suffering a little bit more?
I think one thing I would love to hear you talk about, Sarah, is a little bit like, if not only for yourself, like seeking treatment in order to increase the connection you can make in these early months. I think often I have trouble convincing mothers to always
I
do
know.
it because it's a critical part of their self-care and their health. But for the sake of that early attachment and responsiveness and,
Yes.
missing cues because you can't be present, can you speak a little bit to that? Because I know that's always our compelling way to get moms in.
Yeah, I know. I wish it were different. I see miraculous things happen during pregnancy and postpartum because there is this drive for like, what can I do for my child? I hope, and what we try to cultivate is ultimately it's about you because you being healthy is really the best thing for your child and sort of feeling your best. But certainly the attachment in the early years and early months is hugely important. Some of this data comes from these really interesting still face experiments, for example, that they're all online if you want to look at them. They're old, so they're kind of weird, but there is something to it where mothers who have depression or sort of this still face, right, aren't able to pick up on cues. A lot of what happens initially is this nonverbal sort of smiling, cooing, maybe making eye contact. And what we see with parents that are really struggling in terms of their mental health is they're unable to do that. And that early attachment, we think, is really influential in this child's sort of life and how they attach to other figures in their romantic relationships and their friendships. And so, again, I think if not for you, but I hope that shifts while you're in treatment. Bonding with your infant can be really important. I also have to note though, if you or your partner are having a lot of struggles, it's always important that just one caregiver, right, has that love, affection. And so I think that's also important to sort of not put too much blame or burden on one parent. Also, just as an aside, it's really important to note that yes, the birthing parent can have a lot of these issues, and there's a hormonal component to it, of course. But non birthing parents, fathers, can also struggle during the postpartum period. And so, important to also check in with your partner to see how they're doing.
Absolutely. And as those still face experiments show, repair is always possible. So if this is
Yes.
listening to this talk and you are worried that it's already happened, that you've had a lot of these symptoms and haven't done anything but it, repair is possible forever. That attachment relationship is dynamic, so you
Yes.
didn't miss the boat on anything,
That's right.
and there's always opportunity to grow. So I think moving into nutrition is where we're going next as part of this mental health.
Yeah, so I just kind of want to add a little bit before kind of letting Jennifer take it away. But I'm so excited about nutrition really as medicine. And we're starting to see more and more research and discussion around this. But we really take this as Mavida as one of our important tenets in sort of talking and asking patients, especially if they're coming in with mood and anxiety disorders. One of the first questions I ask is, are you getting any sleep? And what's your food intake like? And I'll often hear, well, I'm eating only packaged foods because that's all I can get my hands on. And so it's all processed, all like a lot of sugars and things that we know to interfere with mental health. Or I'm only eating fast food because that's the fastest. No one else is kind of helping me out. So that's what I have to do. And not to like put more burden or work on parents that are already overwhelmed. But here's a place where I think getting support, whether it's your partner, your family doing a meal train, anyone kind of helping you here is so important because we know that getting these key nutrients can help reduce the risk of some of these issues, and also just sustain you when you're having really long days, sleep deprivation, all of that. And so things that I talk about a lot are omega-3 fatty acids, and foods high in folate, especially during pregnancy. And we have some sort of links to reduce risk of postpartum depression, iron for postpartum anemia, which we know can sort of influence so much in terms of how much energy one has, et cetera. Um, Calcium and vitamin D, B vitamins, and of course, Jennifer will tell you all about that and how their, Chiyo's meals have all of these wonderful nutrients. And
Yeah,
so
so
here, yeah,
I'm happy to voice over kind of
right.
taking from what Sarah has said into then how that obviously plays a part into nutrition as a whole. And so obviously psychological changes, right? The pressure to just feel like a good mom, and whatever that means for you, whether that's outside sources, in-laws, your own parents, and thinking about just what those experiences are and how you're taking them into your own parenting journey. And obviously it's a shift in identity. So whether this is your first child, your second, your third, what does that look like for you? From my own experience, this was something that I was thinking about all the time. Then, adding on working and being a good partner, all of those things really start to feel like they're piling on. And then as we move into also the hormonal changes, there are so many different hormonal processes, and especially during the postpartum period, as soon as you deliver the baby, the hormonal shifts are really quite dramatic. And so a lot of it is running on the adrenaline, running on that cortisol. And as you start to even out, that may change for different people. Typically, postpartum, up to 6 months postpartum, that's when a lot of the changes should be leveling out. But as Sarah was saying, it can be very different for each person. And so, how can you do that through nutrition support, through mental health support, and really make sure that you're preparing for your postpartum period in the best way that you can?
I should also say if you continue to breastfeed and then start weaning, you start to have some of these mood and sort of hormonal shifts again, which can, if someone has sort of waited or breastfed for a year or a year and a half, then some of that can start to happen even then. So that's why it's so variable.
100%. And so, again, we always talk about how can you prepare for your postpartum. As Sarah said, it's so much more than just a meal train and setting up those meals for you. Nutrition can really link to providing those key nutrients for those processes, whether that's supporting your own recovery, tissue repair, your mental health, your cognitive function, and then just key physiological processes. So lactation, the mental load, hormonal balance as a whole, your blood sugar regulation, your digestion, your bowel movements. And so something that, as Sarah had said before, is like if you're just reaching for like very quick things, whether that's fast food, whatever it is, you really need to think about your nutrition as a whole, how that all plays a part. And so, obviously, at Chiyo, we take into consideration your stage, your symptoms, how you're feeling, and inputting all of that nutrition, thinking about all of that for you. And in those moments where, I'm sure if this is maybe your second or your third or even your first, I have tons of stories, whether it's clients or friends who have told me, hey, I'm not feeling very well. I feel like I'm a little bit tired or like my mood is off. And that truly then plays a part into like what you're putting into your body. So, like, say, for example, I had a client who was saying, like, I wasn't eating a ton. I had like a piece of cake. And so, if you're even thinking about like what those things that are just easy that you might gravitate towards might not have the nutrition that's really able to support and sustain your energy, sustain your mood, especially those very, very early days postpartum, where again, sleep is off, you know, you don't know what time it is, you don't know what day it is, and really things are just kind of running on adrenaline. And so, having those really, really great highs of a sugar intake that might give you that really boost of energy, you will likely crash after. And so that kind of feeling cannot be sustained long term. And so eventually you'll start to feel that crash as you're running onto adrenaline, especially as you're thinking about how to sustain that energy long term. So even thinking about how to have regular meals, timing of meals, and avoiding skipping meals is really important. So the big thing that I would like to touch on, especially in the early days postpartum, is just blood sugar regulation. And so I think this is something where, again, I think a lot of folks end up thinking about, their labor, their delivery, what does that look like? But thinking about also then, how am I going to support my own energy if you want to breastfeed, not whatever you decide to do in your postpartum period. But blood sugar regulation, I think, as a whole, is just so important for hormonal balance, again, energy, fatigue, and also addressing your mood and how you're feeling. And so really key ways to really support your blood sugar regulation is to make sure that there's protein in every single bite. So for example, in this picture, this is our cocoa quinoa cookies. And so there's a bit of protein in here, there's healthy fats. And so thinking about composition of your meals is really important. And so as Sarah was saying before, if you're looking to like really quick fast food, even if that's snacks like chips, crackers, or even just like a side of apples, we would consider that essentially just an empty carb because it really is not fulfilling any of the extra nutrients and also the macro that you need for energy. So, proteins, your fats. So, really making sure that each meal that you're consuming or each snack you're even consuming has a bit of protein, fat, and carbs. I think the big thing too is timing of meals, the idea of like breaking your fast. And so obviously in the early days postpartum, again, you don't really know what time it is. You could be up at 4, you could be up at 1, at 3. It's all kind of crazy and such a blur during that time. But really thinking about how are you going to make time to actually have a nutritious snack or meal during those random waking periods, I think is really, really important because you can get so caught up in changing the diaper or feeding the baby or pumping or, even thinking about a bath for yourself during that time that eating almost becomes the last thing that you're thinking about. So always thinking about the timing of your meals, especially those early days. I think at max, like maybe 4 hours at a time. So always remembering like is that making a schedule for yourself or just whatever the timing is that works for you and your family during that time. Fiber rich foods are really important. So, thinking about your leafy greens, raspberries, your whole grains, and then also complex carbohydrates. So, things like oats, quinoa, brown rice. And as I touched to before, in terms of the concept of naked carbs, I think a lot of people typically think if I have fruit, that could be like a really easy snack, but ends up being sometimes spiking your blood sugar because it's known as an empty carb. But if you paired that piece of fruit of apples or something that has maybe more of a higher fiber content, that will really able to balance your blood sugar in a better way. And then in the next slide, this is just an example of like how we think about it and how I would encourage a lot of you to think about how you're thinking about what does the composition of my meals look like. So in this example in particular, every ingredient has a purpose. So for example, tofu is a complete protein. It contains all the essential amino acids for tissue repair, also can address anemia. So like as Sarah said before, something postpartum that can be very common is iron deficiency anemia. And so making sure that you have ample iron sources, what does that look like? And that could be tofu, that could be spinach, obviously a lot of different meat sources, but that will help support your cognitive function. Something like shiitake mushrooms for vitamin D. Again, vitamin D helps support your hormones, but also your absorption of calcium for healthy bones, and then thinking about what those healthy fats could be. So, like a coconut milk, it's dairy free, it's a healthy fat that's going to give you sustainable energy throughout the day. Fiber, another thing we had talked about is something like bok choy or like your other leafy greens. That's obviously going to help support your digestion, your bowel movements. If this is your first child, your first postpartum bowel movement is probably one of the scariest things you will ever do. And so making sure that you have ample fiber, ample hydration is so, so important. And then also thinking about what are those other versions of antioxidants or foods that have just a lot of color, phytonutrients. Those are the things that are really going to help with reducing your swelling and then also boost your immunity.
So, Jennifer, we have one question about when someone gave birth, a lactation consultant told them to have lots of oats to establish milk supply. Now she is 6 weeks postpartum and still breastfeeding. Should she continue to eat oats regularly related to a milk supply?
Is the question if she should continue to eat oats?
Yes. Should I continue eating oats regularly to keep my milk supply high 6 weeks out?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Oats are definitely something known as like a galactagogue. And so I think that's a typical recommendation. The idea is that some of these ingredients will help boost milk supply. Another version would be like fennel, for example. Um, I think my big hot take on milk supply and just making sure that you're producing enough will also just in general be eating enough. So, eating enough calories. So, you can definitely continue to eat your oats if you like it. I think there's definitely other alternatives for breakfasts that you could add. Maybe just like a little bit of oats, whether it's even making like a yogurt kind of like chia seed pudding situation. But oats are definitely not the only galactagogue that's known out there. But I think the big thing that I would love people to focus on and take away is making sure that you're eating enough calories, um, because you definitely want to sustain your own energy, but then also additional energy to make quality breast milk, but then also produce enough for lactation as well.
Great. And I think this other question is for both you and Sarah, which is just to say, are there supplements that are recommended during pregnancy or postpartum related to either supporting mental health or nutritional supplements that either of you recommend regularly?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I'm
for, oh, sorry, do you want to go first?
sure. I think definitely continuing to take your prenatal. There's also a few other like postnatals that exist out there as well. But continuing to do that again to just kind of be that insurance to kind of fill in the gaps when, days are a little bit harder. By no means do I think that, like, for example, I personally eat perfect every day. No, it can be super hard. So I think making sure that you do continue your prenatal or a postnatal is super important.
Yeah, so I think in terms of vitamins and supplements, prenatals are really the only recommended sort of proven evidence-based kind of vitamin that you should be taking. I think with that, it's important to note, even though we're very comfortable with supplements, and I actually, I part of my practice is a lot of complementary medicines. It's important to note that these aren't FDA regulated. So a lot of the things that maybe you're taking when you're not pregnant is important to kind of think about. We don't have that many studies during pregnancy on the safety or during breastfeeding. So just as a little bit of like I used to take all these other supplements that are interesting, but I would really, when pregnant or breastfeeding, would really kind of try to stay clear of things that you're not sure of and really just to the prenatals. One thing that I do feel more comfortable with is like a magnesium supplement. It's a natural anxiolytic, so helps with anxiety, helps with some cramping that can sometimes occur during pregnancy. And that feels really comfortable and can help with sleep, in fact. But apart from that, I actually say, like, let's not be so adventurous during pregnancy just because of the safety data.
Great point. And so I think I'm going to try to transition a little bit to also thinking about how you can support your recovery in this postpartum period by also thinking about like what is your parenting going to look like. So I think we've made it really clear that our version of self-care is really doing these basics for your recovery that feels like you have to take care of your mental health and you have to think about nutrition. And then how can we help empower you to be able to find space for that voice and your preferences around family members and around this role of becoming a mother? So it will not surprise anybody on this call or watching this as a recording that our definition of motherhood has continued to change, that we are in this particular time where mothers are expected to do more than ever and make it look easier and easier, whether it's our portrayal on social media, how some of us would argue that many people try to make it look like it is that perfectly beautiful curated photo, to just our historical perspectives on motherhood and how we have traditionally viewed that role. So we're coming into this journey as parents, and we talked a little bit about that identity shift, really trying to figure out like, hey, what if I don't have any instincts for this? What if things don't feel like it comes naturally to me? What if I don't instantly love my baby and feel like this connection was meant to be? And all of that, though we don't talk about it nearly enough, is normal in this experience. I remember myself holding my daughter and walking by a mirror and seeing myself and this baby together and having this moment where I was like, do we? Oh, we go together now. Like, that's who I am. I'm this person carrying around a baby, right? Like, it was like I had a new accessory, and it just took my brain this second to figure out, like, wow, that is how I now see myself, right? It's like I always say when I'm not looking on Zoom all day and I think I look fabulous, and you get on a Zoom call and you're like, oh my gosh, has my hair been sticking out the whole time, right? It's this remaking of our sense of self. And we get so much choice about that we don't feel like we have any into how we're going to combine motherhood with this identity. And we have lost, traditionally, as Sarah said so well, we were not meant to do this as a solo sport. And we've lost so much of that community, even at a time when so many of us would say, our role as parents is first and foremost in our lives, right? So we spend more time thinking about being parents than any generation before us. And yet we've given ourselves so few supports around doing that most important job really successfully. So hopefully talks like this and all of our brands are here to support you in helping that not to be the case. But we really want to talk practically about some ways to start. And boundaries, I think, are one of my favorite things to talk about in postpartum, which is just to start like addressing where you get to be mama bear or papa bear, right? Like, where do those instincts come in, and how can you help to make this period of recovery for you and really getting to know your baby, that beautiful, like, we're learning together how to do this. How can we do that through supporting healthy boundaries? People ask me all the time, like, are you supposed to have boundaries? Can you have too many boundaries? And I think just like your parenting style, you want to have that balance of sensitivity and boundaries, right? That it goes back and forth. For every person, there is a different balance of like when it feels right to have a hard line. And other times it's like, this is not important to me, right? I can just do this because it makes everything easier and because it's important to someone else. And that's going to be true for you throughout your parenting journey. When we look at all of the research about what type of parenting style is most successful for outcomes, and we would all agree on this call, there's not one type of parenting, but in the research, it washes out to be generally that combination, if you can see my hands on the recording, the combination of limits and boundaries that moves back and forth and back and forth. So we can be sensitive to who our baby is, what their temperament is like, what our temperament is like, what our co-parent's temperament is like, what our mother-in-law's temperament is like, and also what things we really want to hold on to. So when we start thinking about unsolicited advice, people trying to tell you what to do all the time, people who make negative comments. I just had a client the other day who said, I told somebody what my baby's name was going to be, and they said, that was the worst boy in my class and I hated him, so I don't think I can ever hear that name again. All the comments that you're like, why would anyone say that to each other, right? What are we going to do with comparisons? Your sister's son was walking before yours was, and this baby's still breastfeeding and you stopped, and all of the kind of guilt trips that we get stuck into. How can we begin in this early period to establish for ourselves what our safe place is going to be and how we're going to respond to that? And so one of the things we have to start with is just figuring out what that little voice is that feels discomfort when people say things to you. Like, I often say to parents, you don't have to have a gut for what to do with a colicky baby, right? That's like a new experience for most of us. And if I just tell you, like, go with your gut, that usually doesn't reassure you. And as Sarah, I'm sure, can say, like, the worst thing you can say to an anxious person is like, just don't worry about it. Just go with what you feel. Like, that never, ever has that helped anyone, right? But where we can tell you to tap into that gut is thinking through, like, that just doesn't make me feel good. This is not a person that feels like they support me, or those comments or that Instagram account. It just doesn't feel like it represents my values right now and what's important to me as a parent. And starting to notice that can do you a lot of good in actually attempting to address it, right? So finding those patterns, what is it about that situation? And then how am I going to get the language? So these are just some, at Cooper, we're all about like really practical strategies. So this is some specific language you could try on. Things like saying, Mom, I know at our house, you and Dad were at your phones during the mealtime, but we're trying to do a tech-free dinner, right? Like things that we can just start to approach about how you were raised versus how you want your child to be raised. So you went to church on Christmas, and we're not going to do that. We're going to get takeout, very healthy Chiyo meals, not fast food, bad takeout. And we're going to do a movie night, and that feels what's right for us. And our baby is 3 months old. I remember having Thanksgiving like 3 weeks postpartum, and my family suggesting that we should still cook. And me saying, like, really, I'm pretty sure catering will work for this. I'd rather be at a meal and have everybody at my house rather than have the stress of cooking, right? So the permission to redo traditions, to rethink how we did things like bedtime. Bedtime feels like, if you're not feeding or sleeping, what are you doing in these early months, right? And so the sleeping feels like one of the most important tasks you have as a parent. And so saying, like, we need dinner to be wrapped up at 6 o'clock so I can start that bedtime routine and get this baby down might be a really important boundary that you have to set for people who still want to do things late at night, or still think that that's the way that you operated, last month when you didn't have a child. So those are just some of the examples of figuring that out. Why is it so hard for us to do? Well, most of us are also trying to be sensitive and take the perspective of others, and leads to real people pleasing. But some of the things that we can start to do is sort of be honest about our stress and anxiety. One of the best things we can do is just acknowledge that these thoughts keep coming up for us, that there are things that we're concerned about, or that we need help in this moment. So I say to new parents all the time, like, you can start every sentence with, like, this is really hard for me right now, but I'm feeling, right? And you can say, look, I might be crazy, but right now I need. It doesn't matter how you want to frame it, but owning that right now for you, that stress and anxiety is real, can help you feel like you have permission to say something you may not have otherwise said. So maybe there's a family member or a friend where you've always been the available one, you've always been the yes person. But if you start with, like, look, I know that I really always want to say yes to you, but right now I just don't feel like I'm able to. And we have a lot of really good data that if you can make peace with the stress and anxiety in this early period, if you can not feel disappointed every time you feel nervous again about something, but instead say, oh, here it comes, that nervousness that I know that I'm going to have, right? There they are. Welcome to all those feelings. Then you can approach them with that prefrontal cortex, with that wizard part of your brain, instead of feeling that assault of, like, oh God, I was doing so well, and then I had that anxious thought and everything fell apart, right? So how can we sort of prepare and be honest about the difficulty in this transition? And part of that is that we don't need beautiful pictures on our social media feeds. We don't need to pretend that we're doing okay all the time. Instead, the honesty can help us have more open communication. So, thinking of the 3 R's around communication, what helps you feel grounded? How do you regulate? And that's for everybody in the home. Do you need a quiet house? Do you need less visitors? Do you want more visitors and more activities because keeping you busy helps you feel grounded? Like, what does that look like for you? And really advocating for that in your communication with others. Like, I need someone to visit me today, because what will really make me feel good is having a conversation that isn't about what's going on with the bottles or how many diapers I've changed. Or I need no one to come over today because I need silence and just getting back to my routines and reorganizing the onesies in the closet, right? Because that feels good to me. So what does that look like? And then relate the ways that we can connect and talk and share. So my husband and I often talk about our relationship as it's changed as parents being about logistics, right? We talk a lot throughout the day, and a lot of it is like, who's doing pickup? Where did they go? What did I forget? What happened with the school assignment? Did you make that thing? What are they eating for dinner? Right? And not a lot about our genuine feelings anymore. And that's a great thing to get in touch with now. Are we actually talking about our experience? Are you saying, something as simple as today's a 6 for me? Right? And do a 1 out of 10 scale where you just check in. Like, how are you feeling today? How does it feel like it's going? Because in the span of an hour for a new parent, right, you can go from a 10 to a 1 and back to a 10. So really having that opportunity to say, I value what's going on with me and I want to talk about it with someone, and there is someone I can share it with, even if it's a friend I call every morning and just check in with my number. And then reason. So it is a high time of stress and anxiety, and because of that, none of us are at our best when we're sort of acting with that emotional lizard brain. So taking a minute to say, let's come back to this when I can have just a moment of time to think it through and be in my best headspace to have this. So they've done really interesting studies. If we could all just count to three, we would make such a better decision on the other side, right? So thinking through just that instant like reaction and saying, if I can count to three and take a breath, we can return to this later. And that will help smooth over a lot of the communication that feels like it's the hardest in some of these key moments. And then that parental growth mindset. So everybody loves to talk about a fixed and growth mindset for their children, but for you, really accepting that you are not meant to be good at this all of the time. There is no such thing. We wouldn't even want to be perfect at it. It would be such a burden for our children to have a perfect parent, right? We have to mess up and show them that we can make mistakes. So feel that, give yourself that gift of that feeling that you are growing and learning every day, and that mistakes and failures and hard days are part of that process. Give yourself the value of a reset. I do resets all day long. I do them with my children, I do them with myself, I do them with my partner. Just this idea that we can say, you know what? Let's just reset. Let's start over. Let's set our intention to do this moment again better and start over. And then let the rest of the blame and the shame and the guilt go. We know that guilt and shame shuts down our capacity for critical thinking, for making our best decisions. So there's just really no point in reliving it. If the one thing you can take from this talk is that like you and how you are feeling and doing and caring for yourself in the moment is of paramount importance to everything else that happens, you deserve to just let it go, right? One bad minute just isn't worth it for you to beat yourself up about endlessly. So we want you to sort of take all of that as the inspiration for taking care of yourselves. We'd love to answer more questions and talk specifically about, all of our brands and how we can support you. Here are all the codes, which I think we're going to put in chat as well. But definitely taking advantage of this sort of like holistic approach to parenting. Anything else that ladies you wanted to add, or I will stop the share and get us into
Oh,
some
it's
questions.
fantastic.
And the chat and the Q&A are open. If there's anyone brave enough to ask or tell us anything going on. Oh, I have one Q&A. Oh, this is a good question. I think, well, I don't know, Jennifer, if it's up your alley to answer, but if you are having a severe amount of nausea and vomiting throughout pregnancy and are unable to eat a healthy diet, how much is your recovery in the postpartum repair for some of that? Oh, this happened to me. I was throwing up all of my first pregnancy, and my husband at our OB visits would say things like, she's not eating any vegetables. Like he was like telling on me, like, and I know it came out of concern, but I was like, you try eating vegetables when you're throwing up all day. How much recovery do you make in the postpartum period for that? And is that something that you need to be worried about if you're throwing up all the time or nauseous all the time?
Yeah, I think that again, there is no like perfect day for any single person. And even if someone isn't feeling nauseous, um, similarly to Marielle, I, with my second, ended up just having really awful afternoon nausea and couldn't feed my family, couldn't feed myself. And it's super common. How will that affect your postpartum recovery? I mean, depending on where you are, in your pregnancy, there's still a lot of time, right? And so thinking about it truly just like on a day-to-day basis or even hour by hour, depending on how you're feeling, I think is really important. And not trying not to think about what or how that will affect me in the future. I think really taking it, day by day about how you can be better, at this meal or how you're feeling in this instant. A lot of maybe options that you can think about, maybe those are smoothies or soups or broths. Those are a really great way to get a lot of those trace minerals. Again, that will really help how you're feeling, your hydration, but also contribute to your mental health as well.
Great. And Sarah, I think just a question about how you talk to your partner about concerns you may be having around their mood. It seems like such a sensitive topic to bring up, and it feels hard to notice or comment on correctly. What would your that's
Yeah, I think it's really tough. But I think leading with curiosity might be the first place to go, and with your own vulnerabilities and sort of talking about how this transition is not a piece of cake. It's really, really complex. And so I think ask curiosity and asking questions can be the place to go, not like I'm observing this, why don't you go to treatment? And being really sort of mindful that in some ways, especially in heterosexual relationships, if you have a partner who is a male heterosexual, that there's a lot of issues in terms of how they've been raised potentially. And this is making generalizations, but for a lot of men, it can be depression can manifest as anger, and that's complicated, as well as like being isolated and not as engaged. And certainly, I think there isn't enough discussion around mental health and verbalizing feelings. That's why I'm so excited about this generation and how we're raising boys, hopefully differently, so they are comfortable crying and they are comfortable expressing different emotions. But just to know that, that is really difficult for a lot of men in our culture. And so kind of treading lightly. And I guess the main thing that I would kind of keep in your mind is lead with curiosity, not with accusations or kind of observations necessarily. And that might be a good place to start the conversation.
and it's so hard, right? Because I think it's with everything related to mental health, like it's a hard, sort of compilation of symptoms, right? To figure out like what is the normal amount to be anxious. Or I say like I wasn't a big yeller, and then I had toddlers and I discovered I really know how to yell. Like there are sort of that
Yes.
evolving parts of us that I feel in my parenting journey, and I'm sure you would tell me there's science to back it up. Like at every moment you're really responding to a situation in a new way, and since you haven't done that moment before, it's hard to
Yes.
always gauge whether your reaction is appropriate or when you might need help.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult, and that's why it's nice to have like an open dialogue with the person that you are sort of doing this with and that you live with, and who can have a little bit of a pulse on it. And I think maybe even starting with your own, like, hey, have you noticed any of these things? Like, these are what I hear are some warning signs. Oh, did you know that men can also experience this? Like, is this something that you've thought about, or are you having some difficulty with this transition? Like, I know I am, whatever it is. So I think even opening the conversation, or what can be really helpful is starting it before having babies, like during the pregnancy or even trying to conceive. We know that couples that struggle to conceive, both men and women who are having issues with fertility, have 1 in 2 has depression or anxiety. And so it is something that can even start before we think about the becoming a parent. But I think of the trying to conceive bucket as also kind of becoming parents as well.
Absolutely. And I think that how difficult that process may be for a couple has a lot to do with also the expectations of the postpartum
Yes.
period, and thinking that all of a sudden, no matter how much you wanted this baby or how hard you worked for this baby,
Yes.
it can still be really difficult. And I
Really
think
hard.
that's really hard to accept.
Yeah.
Great. Anybody else with questions out there? Let us know. Any final thoughts, ladies, or anything we didn't get a chance to say that we want to? Okay. I will put these codes back up so that as we are ending, if anybody is interested, please reach out. Oh, one more message in chat. I'm so bad at working all of the things to make sure I can read everything and speak at the same time. Oh, that's with all of our codes. Great. So our codes are in chat and up on your screen. And we thank you all so much for being here or for watching this recording. And ladies, this was so fun.
Thank you so much for having
Everyone.
us.
Bye.
Bye.